Alright, I lied. I think I'll go ahead and keep reading Che Guevara's Guerrilla Warfare. I have no idea how that last video did. Frankly, I don't really look at the performance of these because I'm doing them for myself and my own amusement and entertainment and sense of mind. That's not to say. Peace of mind? Yeah, peace of mind is the expression, but sensibilities, whatever. I do it for me. If you like it, hell yeah, but, you know, if you're not into it, dude, I get it. I get it. Let's see, what's the range on this? Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Quit fucking with this. It was just bugging me how that line was clearly off at an angle. I'd like to look a little less short. You know, got biology to blame for that. Let's pick up where we left off. Part 2. Guerrilla Strategy. In guerrilla terminology, strategy is understood as the analysis of the objectives to be achieved in the light of the total military situation and the overall ways of achieving and reaching these objectives. To have a correct strategic appreciation from the point of view of a guerrilla band, it's necessary to analyze fundamentally what will be the enemy's mode of action. If the final objective is always the complete destruction of the opposite force, the enemy is confronted in the case of a civil war of this kind with the standard task. They will have to achieve the total destruction of each of the components of the guerrilla band. The guerrilla fighter, on the other hand, must analyze the resources which the enemy has for trying to achieve that outcome. The means in men, in mobility, in popular support, in armaments, and capacity of leadership on which they can count. We must make our own strategy adequate on the basis of these studies, keeping in mind always the final objective of defeating the enemy army. And it's really interesting that Che imagines a civil war as a war. Imagines resistance is a purely martial thing. He's not talking about winning hearts and minds. Right now he's not talking about subduing them without fighting, like in The Art of War. He's just talking about fighting until there's no fight left. Total annihilation, total obliteration, which is well, not often remarked of and regarded as strategic excellence or intelligence. But not to say it wasn't effective. There are fundamental aspects to be defeating the enemy army. Yeah. There are fundamental aspects to be studied. The armament, for example. The manner of using this armament. The value of a tank, of an airplane. In a fight this type must be weighed. The arms of the enemy, his ammunition, his habits must be considered. Because the principal source for provision for the guerrilla force is precisely in the enemy's armaments. If there is a possibility of choice, we should prefer the same type used by the enemy, since the greatest problem of the guerrilla band is a lack of ammunition, which the opponent must provide. After the objectives have been fixed and analyzed, it's necessary to study the order of the steps leading to the achievement of the final objective. They should be planned in advance, even though it would be modified and adjusted as fighting develops and unforeseen circumstances arise. As the adage goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Now, when I first read this, I thought that was actually quite smart, right? Of course you use the same type of armaments and ammunition as the force that you're fighting. If you're not producing it, they're producing it. So the idea of, say, during the Cold War, an American insurrection or rebellion using AK-47s, when 7.62s were not the most widespread form of ammunition utilized by the armed forces or the police forces in the United States, according to Che, would be a bad choice. So, so as almost ironic as it is, people carrying around bow Americana weaponry would actually be the best suited to undertaking this sort of thing, if Jay's hypothesis carries. But I think Che isn't taking into account the statistic that got like 90-something percent, there we go, of shots fired in a war aren't even intended to hit a target. Like a very, very small margin of marksmen, of soldiers, actually shoot to kill, especially when conscripted. It's reassuring in a way that we are so reluctant and hardwired not to take human lives, though obviously there are exceptions. After the objectives have been analyzed and fixed, it's necessary to study the order of the steps leading to the achievement of the final objective. It should be planned in advance. Oh yeah, I already read that. Ha. At the outset, the essential task of a guerrilla fighter is to keep themselves from being destroyed. Little by little, it will be easier for members of the guerrilla band, or bands, to adapt themselves to their own form of life, to make fight and escape from forces that are on the offensive an easy task, because it's performed daily. When this condition is reached, the guerrilla, having taken up the inaccessible positions out of reach of the enemy, or having assembled forces that deter the enemy from attacking, ought to proceed to the gradual weakening of the army. This will be carried out, at first at those points nearest to the point of active warfare against the guerrilla band, and later will be taken deeper into enemy territory, attacking his communications, later attacking and harassing his base of operations and his central bases, tormenting him on all sides to the full extent of the capabilities of the guerrilla forces. Now, this is very vague, right? That you continue fight and escape until you reach inaccessible positions, or having assembled a force that can deter the enemy from attacking. In the Cuban Revolution, it's not exactly what happened. And the idea of there being inaccessible positions, I think, applies to the militarization of that age, right? The technology of that age. I mean, even now, today, you can't sustain effectively the military force in, I don't know, space or the Arctic for a prolonged period of time. You can have a small garrison, and we certainly do, but in the 60s and in Cuba, there were definitely places where the army was unable or unwilling to go, mostly unwilling to go. In the United States, I don't know, it's a harder ask, right? We don't, well, I suppose there's the bayou, right? Yeah, that's actually a great comparison. It's a similar ecological region. During the Civil War in the Confederacy, oh my god, there's a fucking movie made about this. Civil War, Swamp, Revolt, CSA. Let's see if that gets me anywhere. Yeah, the Free State of Jones. My god, that worked. Google is an amazing tool. The Free State of Jones is an excellent example of this. 1863, 1864, a Confederate group of Confederate soldiers and people living in the Confederacy revolted. It was only like one town, one county, I think. Well, whatever. Yeah, it's in Mississippi. Successfully revolted and held off the Confederate army indefinitely for the entirety of the war. They hung out in the swamp and had like a nigh assailable position. Also, the Confederacy was occupied with this whole trying to beat the Union thing unsuccessfully. Great example of an American rebellion that got to that point. Now, the problem that the Free State of Jones had and a lot of would-be revolts run into, is they can get to the point where they're unassailable or just outside of reach. But then this magical transition from that to being on the offensive, it's a tough ask. It's a very tough ask, and it's possible, but very difficult, especially when the warfare is so asymmetric. I mean, revolution in the 1960s was asymmetric. Today, it's especially so. The blow should be continuous. The enemy soldier in a zone of operations ought not to be allowed to sleep. Again, this is straight from the art of war. Don't let them rest. Outposts ought to be attacked and liquidated systematically. At every moment, the impression ought to be created that they are surrounded in a complete circle. In wooded and broken areas, this comfort should be maintained both day and night. In open zones are easily penetrated by enemy patrols, at night only. In order to do all this, absolute cooperation of the people, in order to do this, the absolute cooperation of the people and a perfect knowledge of the ground is necessary. The two necessities affect every minute of the life of the guerrilla fighter. Therefore, along the center is a study of present and future zone of operations. Intensive popular work must be undertaken to explain the motives of the revolution, its ends, and to spread the incontrovertible truth that victory of the enemy against the people is finally impossible. Whoever does not feel this undoubted truth cannot be a guerrilla fighter. So now he starts talking about the importance of the political work, of the ideological work, of the cultural work of a revolution, right? It's to get assistance from the local population, and not necessarily to mobilize them and convince them all to take up arms. Che is making the case again that the revolutionary fighter is more like this knight figure, and that not everyone has to pick up a gun or a knife or a Molotov cocktail, right? All you have to do is make sure the people picking up a gun or a knife or a Molotov cocktail are safe. Which leans into his understanding of the nuance of this sort of thing. It's a revolution is not when everybody all at once goes into the street and starts breaking into government buildings. It gets to that point sometimes, but most of the time it's small acts of rebellion, small acts of resistance that build and build and build and eventually cascade into something more widespread. But these unsung heroes, that he's calling peasants because they were, are the people who protect and shelter these militant ideologues who begin the fight, who start lighting these fuses. This popular work should at first be aimed at securing secrecy. That is, each peasant, each member of society in which action is taking place, will be asked not to mention what they see and hear. Later, help will be sought from inhabitants whose loyalty to the revolution offers greater guarantees. Still later, use will be made of these persons in missions of contact, for transporting goods or arms as guides in zones familiar to them. Still later, it's possible to arrive at organized mass action and centers of work, of which the final result will be a general strike. Now this is an interesting tier list, right? The first sin against the state is secrecy, which is so delicious given how much intrigue and secrecy a state needs to undertake in order to control and mollify its population. So collaboration begins with not calling the police, with not reporting a crime. Not because all cops are bastards, but because you know the motivation for those crimes. Personally, this is something that's given me a lot of pause. Doing the work I've been doing, part of it has been security, monitoring a building for people trying to break in, things like that, and What I have been supposed to do is call the police, but instead I'll go up and just tell them to leave, and they're on camera and they're being stupid because, listen, people committing crimes aren't often doing it for the most part out of malice or some desire to be putting themselves and others at risk. It's most of the time they're doing it out of necessity and desperation. So you need the empathy and compassion and understanding of the populace. Then you can start asking them for small things and work up the chain. Just like any other organization, inclusion and access to secrecy and limited knowledge is a process of being integrated into this organization. But again, the organized mass action and the centers of work, it's just this interesting build-up. It's very nebulous, right? Okay, first I just like look the other way when people steal from a supermarket because maybe they need that to survive, right? That's pretty doable. Like, you're not committing a crime and not reporting a crime most of the time. You're not participating. You may be tangentially related to it, but that's very hard to prove. It's very easy to plead ignorance if there's not solid proof of coordination. Then the cooperation in transporting goods and arms, acting as guides, and that's a little more proactive. That's not just looking the other way when you see somebody shoplifting or somebody destroying anti-homeless emplacements, like the fucking sidewalk spikes. This is, telling somebody, hey, the cops are a block away, or telling them about dumpsters that are unlocked, that they can go dumpster diving in, or this is using your local knowledge that you may not act on criminally in any way with those willing to bend or break societal norms or rules or expectations for this cause. Again, you're not a direct participant, but you're lending your knowledge, your expertise to those who are more militarized, more radicalized, more incentivized to participate in this. I think it's very important to take a moment and reflect that Che does not condemn people for not getting involved. Instead, he valorizes and lauds involvement, participation. He lifts up those who do more work and put themselves more at risk, but he isn't chastising those who choose not to, or feel too vulnerable to, or feel economically or spiritually or ideologically unable to. But there is this cascade of you can fight, you can participate in small ways, and these small ways are important. And eventually, after the people have realized that they can do these smaller things and have praxis in these smaller ways, you can eventually mobilize them into a general strike, into taking the next step, into actually taking action or inaction themselves. The strike is a most important factor in civil war, but in order to reach it, a series of complementary conditions are necessary which do not always exist, and which very rarely come to exist spontaneously. Like, say, the pandemic. It's necessary to create these essential conditions, basically by explaining the purposes of the revolution and demonstrating the forces of the people and their possibilities. It's also possible to have recourse in certain very homogeneous groups, which must have shown their efficacy previously in less dangerous tasks in order to make use of another of the terrible arms of the guerrilla band, sabotage. It's possible to paralyze entire armies, to suspend the industrial life of a zone, leaving inhabitants of a city without factories, light, water, communications of any kind, without being able to risk travel by highway except at certain hours. If all of this is achieved, the morale of the enemy falls, the morale of his combatant units weakens, and the fruit ripens for plucking at a precise moment. So while Che does lean on language that's very Sun Tzu-y in a way, he is no Clausewitz, right? He isn't talking about war as a continuation of politics by other means. He's talking about war like morale, like elan, like, oh my god, who was the French philosopher? Theorist. That's not gonna get me what I want. Vitalism? I can't remember. I can't remember. It was a French school of thought that we in America have participated in. This idea of warfare tends to be won and executed by acts of individual exceptionalism. That's why we have medals, that's why we celebrate war heroes, it's why we have all these war films about these exceptional people who did these crazy things, because we want to encourage that kind of exceptionalism and that kind of morale, that kind of attitude in our fighting force, that you are capable of limited executive decisions and executive choices, executive action within a theater. The idea is there's no way for commanding officers to be able to see and hear and know everything going on in a field of battle, in a theater of conflict at all times. So it's getting easier, so it's better to teach and inspire your soldiers to make those decisions for themselves given certain guidelines. NJ seems to be inclined to the same sort of thing. All of this presupposes an increase in the territory included within the guerrilla action. But an excessive increase of this territory is to be avoided. It is essential, always, to preserve a strong base of operations and to continue strengthening it during the course of the war. Within this territory, measures of indoctrination of the inhabitants of the zone should be utilized. Measures of quarantine should be taken against the irreconcilable enemies of the revolution. All purely defensive measures, such as trenches, mines, and communications, should be perfected. Remember, this army, this guerrilla band that Che is talking about, is not an invading force. You don't need to expand your zone of control beyond where you live. A revolution army is set out to liberate and to facilitate the liberation of those trying to liberate themselves, in theory. Now, obviously, at some point, there are strongholds that will be staunchly for the status quo, for conservative powers and conservative attitudes. And eventually, you have to come to hit those at head. But this idea that you create an unassailable point and then slowly expand that point. You know, find something that can't be hit, and then find a way to make it bigger, and find a way to make it bigger, and find a way to make it bigger, and make it bigger, and make it bigger, and make it bigger. And slowly, he brushes over it, but when he's talking about measures of indoctrination of the inhabitants of the zone should be utilized, and measures of quarantine should be taken against irreconcilable enemies of the revolution, it's interesting, right? Those are very vague, yet potentially very drastic actions. Indoctrination can be media. It can be news. It can be public education. It can be nationalism, spiritualism. It can be a lot of things. So, you know, he's not picking one particular way to sway people. He's just saying it's necessary to sway people. Measures of quarantine is such a nice way to say imprisoning people or executing people. I mean, a quarantine's gotta end eventually, right? Either when those in quarantine are no longer dangerous or infectious, and if you consider an ideology dangerous, it's very unlikely that imprisoning somebody is going to squash that ideology. So, yeah, that doesn't seem like it's a good long-term decision. I mean, obviously, the intent is to protect the base, right? Protect your sphere of influence, protect your local area. If you know that there are people who are likely to report you or turn on you or try to undermine you, well, then obviously you don't want them around, right? So you try to quarantine and control their access to accurate information and knowledge. Better would be giving them false information. Better would be using that to your advantage, but that's very difficult work. Mines, Geneva Convention, maybe. Not a big fan of those, but when a guerrilla band has reached a respectable power in arms and a number of combatants, it ought to proceed to the formation of new columns. This is an act similar to that of a beehive, when at a given moment it releases a new queen, who goes on to another region with a part of the swarm. The mother hive, with the most notable guerrilla chief, will stay in less dangerous places, while the new columns will penetrate other enemy territories following the cycle already described. So, it's not this singular central entity of the rebellion that spreads. You take a town, or a village, or a city, or a county, or just a neighborhood, and you secure that, and you hold that, and you make it safe like the Black Panthers tried to. And once that's safe, you hold it. But then you might have excess manpower, excess supplies, arms, intellectuals, idealists, that you can then send to leave the community and spread the message, spread the movement, spread the ideology to other areas, to other regions, and help them grow there. That's the real mean of advancements here. Not goose-stepping columns of soldiers or tanks or dive bombers or people waving the American flag off of toppled statues. No, it's moving and inspiring people to take up their own movement and facilitating them in collaborating with their self-liberation. A moment will arrive in which the territory occupied by the columns is too small for them, and in the advance towards regions solidly defended by the enemy, it will be necessary to confront powerful forces. At that instant, the columns rejoin, offering a compact fighting front, and a war of positions is reached, a war carried out by regular armies. However, the former guerrilla army cannot cut itself off from its base. It should create new guerrilla bands behind the enemy, acting in the same way as the original bands operating earlier, proceeding thus to penetrate enemy territory until it's dominated. So at a certain point, Shay feels that certain places you can't infiltrate, certain places you can't turn, you can't change. Say like, oh, I don't know, trying to convince people in rural Alabama that socialism is good. It's possible, but it's gonna take a long time. Eventually you reach the point where you do come up against a position, say Washington, D.C., that you can't ideologically flip, or would take a long time to. And at that point, apparently direct confrontation is the way to go forward. But a thing I've always struggled with Che is, to me, it seems like he takes for granted the quality and quantity of the armed forces he was up against. Reading this, I'm always struck by this frustrated notion that there's no way it would succeed in the United States. I've spoken about this for, God, over a decade now. When people talk about the importance of the Second Amendment, honestly, I'm coming around, but I don't see what a handgun or a shotgun or a rifle, semi-automatic, automatic, bolt action, doesn't matter, what a single rifle and a single marksman can do in the face of orbital satellites, nuclear bombs, armored columns, military-industrial complex. But he's not saying that's the entirety of the war. The entirety of the war is a war of the mind. It's a war of ideals, a war of belief. If soldiers are people who are impacted by economic and social disparity as much as anyone else. They're conditioned, absolutely, to not think in those terms, but they can. They absolutely can. Smedley Butler is a beautiful example of this. If you haven't read Smedley Butler, go read War is a Racket. He is a beautiful person. Dead, obviously. This was a long time ago. So I don't know. The Che doesn't have an academic background in military strategy. So reaching the point in which a guerrilla force is able to enforce its will upon a standing army funded by the larger sum of a GDP the size of the United States. Phew, buddy, like, that's a tall order. It is thus the guerrillas reach stage of the attack, of encirclement of fortified bases, defeat of reinforcements, of mass action, and ever more ardent in the whole national territory of finally achieving at the objective of the war, victory. Again, you know, a little vague, right? But of course you can't weigh this out in a step-by-step, and every nation is going to be different. But I mean, the regime that Castro and Che fought against, very different materially, organizationally, industrially, economically, than the forces that a would-be rebellion or insurgency or guerrilla group in the United States would be faced against. It's apples and oranges, right? They're sort of similar in a way, but not really. I really, it's been nice rereading this. And I think the what I'm taking away from today's section, and hey, we're now 18 pages in out of 140 something. The importance of the ideological battle, and this is something I've been ruminating on a lot lately, honestly. How do you do that? How do you expose people to new ideas? How do you expose people to opening their eyes to unpleasant realities? That, say, in the United States, news is not there to inform you, news is there to manipulate you. It's not for your well-being, it's for social stability. That corporations own the people, employ the people speaking to you, controlling what they say, to an extent controlling what they say and don't say, what information they provide and don't provide. Small example, what presidential candidates they give airtime to, who they spin to talk about has won or is winning, or I mean, look at the dialogue and the rhetoric used in 2016 about the inevitability that Hillary Clinton would win. Well, even though all of the projections and data and facts that they were spewing, I'm not about to go off on a fucking spiel about fake news. Most news networks, tell the truth the majority of the time. But the importance is why they're telling the stories that they're telling. Why are they talking about this instead of this? It's just good analysis and critique of any type of art. And make no mistake, news in the United States is entertainment, primarily. Every form of art, every act of creation is political. Intentionally or not, it's political. It either works to convince its audience of something, connect to its audience in a way, resonate with its audience in a way. Everything, every creation is political. It either tells its audience that the world it exists in, the status quo, is normal, should be accepted and embraced, or that it should be upturned and changed. And yeah, it's difficult living in the times that we do, just end statement, but particularly trying to imagine ways in which we can get more people to listen to the ideas of we can afford universal health care, and we don't need so many institutions that control us. Most countries work significantly less hours than we do, have more paid time off, maternity leave, more vacation, paid vacation time, shorter days, shorter working week. By all accounts, accounting for inflation, minimum wage in the United States should be something like $20, even just keeping up with what its original established goal was. How do we get people to appreciate that we can do better and we should be doing better in almost every single facet of our society? I'm very alienated from the mindset that we shouldn't be paying everyone better, that there shouldn't be an income cap. There's this notion, and I've heard it all throughout my academic career, that Americans, I forget who said this, Americans don't see themselves as oppressed. Americans see themselves as temporarily disadvantaged millionaires. That we're all going to make it rich. Eventually, one day I'll have money. Eventually, my card's going to come up. I'll be fine. One day I'll get out of this joint. That kind of thing. Americans, culturally, for whatever reason, are really resistant to class consciousness. To recognizing, no dude, it's not. That if you make $36,000 a year, you make more than half of the country. And you're probably statistically not going to go up from there. That we live in a highly stratified, highly classed society. Very racist, sexist, bigoted society, systemically, institutionally, economically, politically. I feel personally, and I'll stop at this because it's been about 40 minutes, I personally feel that a lot of our resistance to those ideas, you just don't want to entertain it. Not really. When I was younger, and hadn't yet read the Communist Manifesto. I read it as a joke. I did. I really did. I read it because I'm like, haha, communism. What a silly, antiquated thing. Civil War's over. Karl Marx. So edgy. It wasn't until I sat with the ideas for years, or at least a year, a significant amount of time, and ruminating on it, and having that in the back of my mind while I watched the world around me, that it started to sink in that Marx had a lot of good points. And, you know, I read more theory, and I got more curious about, well, what's this, and how does this work, and what would this look like? Because we are so ingrained to accept the status quo and to assume any questioning of the status quo comes from a place of naivete, right? From a place of, oh, bless your heart, you just don't know any better. Oh, we can't vote for a third candidate because then the other guy will win, dummy. Third parties can't win because they just can't. Because no one votes for them. Because they can't win. Circular logic. We have so much circular logic underpinning so much in our society, which has to be challenged at some point. I know, we are very much in a unique circumstance, the kind that Shay is saying that you can't count on happening, that's calling a lot of these things into question for people who would rather not question them. How come we can print 3 times the amount of money we have in circulation for the benefit primarily of corporations, but we can't spend $2 trillion on erasing student loans, providing housing for everyone, Medicare for all, food programs, work programs? Nah, let's print out 3 times that much and just kiss it away into offshore holding accounts and stock buybacks. Yeah. People are angry and scared right now. They should be. If you look at a chart of the 2008 crash, the stock market crash in 1920s, and the COVID-19 crash, it's mirroring the crash in the 20s way more than the 2007-2008 crash, but it's amplified and it's happening faster, it's happening more intensely. Okay, last thing, I swear. So if you were born and raised in the United States, had the lucky privilege of going to public school, you probably read about World War II. Now, this probably would have been, let's see, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, around there, middle school. And when we were taught about World War II, first we're taught about World War I. It happened because some guy in Austria-Hungary got shot, and then, I don't know, whatever, it's not really important, we're just talking about World War I, so we can talk about World War II. And when we talk about World War II, first we have to talk about the rise of fascism. And the rise of fascism, a key component that history books love to make fun of the Weimar Republic for, Germany, in the interregnum period between World War I and World War II, is their hyperinflation crisis, is how they didn't have the money to pay off their loans and their war reparations to the Allies, or the Entente. So they printed more money. They didn't have enough money, so they printed more money. The way to solve a crisis. And we all laughed at this in middle school, all of us in this country. We laughed at the absurdity of the idea of buying yourself out of a hole. And now we have fucking privileged idiots in the highest offices of the country. Money machine go brrr. Right, right, yeah. I've been enjoying reading this. I hope that you're staying safe. Don't go to work. Don't fucking go to work. I just quit my job tonight. Because they're like, actually, Alex, your position is essential. I'm like, I don't care. I'm not going. This is not safe to me. I'm not getting hazard pay. I would rather collect unemployment and wait this thing out. Because, shit, dude. I'm not at high risk, but I don't want to carry it. I don't want to perpetuate it. And I think it's absurd that the rich can just continue to have servants, essentially. That's what a concierge is. Servants work for them when there's a fucking pandemic and not pay them more than $18.50 an hour. Oh, you know what? I'm out. I'm doing well. I hope you're doing well too. I hope you're taking care of each other. Keep reading, keep talking, keep radicalizing. There's talks of a rent strike going around right now. Honestly, I'm not sold on it, but it's something to think about, particularly if you see this before the end of the month. Remember that evictions, there's a moratorium on them in many states, and, well, just something to think about. Do some reading about, land ownership and landlordship, and see where you fall there. I'm not advocating either way, because personally I'm undecided, but, yeah. Things are hard. I'm not gonna lie to you. They're gonna get worse. So, fucking organize, collaborate, educate, and have some goddamn compassion out there. So tomorrow, toodaloo. Take care. Bye-bye.